Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to the hushed, long-ago castles of Central Europe, where the air is thick with the scent of old wood and the quiet rustle of immense, centuries-old documents. We are walking along the winding family trees of power, tracing the faint, slow echoes of decisions made in dimly lit chambers long ago. Imagine the heavy, leather-bound books of lineage being opened, their pages revealing a political strategy that was as steady as a distant drumbeat. We are following the path of a powerful dynasty that decided to weave its royal threads tighter and tighter, seeking to preserve an empire through careful, constant marriage. We watch as the consequences of that choice quietly begin to manifest, showing up like a distinct shadow in the portraits hanging in the royal galleries. The light catches the subtle, unmistakable feature that becomes a geological marker of their ambition. So before the night carries you away, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, just if it felt peaceful. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. We're going to take a long, slow drift now, sliding back a few centuries to a time when your choice of spouse wasn't really your choice at all. It was more like a very serious, long-term business merger, often involving a truly breathtaking amount of paperwork and a complete disregard for anything as mushy as personal compatibility. The people at the center of this dynastic maze were the Habsburgs. They were, for a very long stretch of European history, what you might call the biggest power players on the block. The family that collected kingdoms and empires like other people collect stamps. Now, collecting kingdoms is a complicated business. It requires a lot of maneuvering, a bit of luck on the battlefield, and perhaps most importantly, a very strategic approach to marriage. The Habsburgs weren't subtle about this. They had a family motto that pretty much summed up their entire geopolitical strategy: Belligerant Ali, to Felix Austria Nubi. That translates, rather poetically, to let others wage war, you happy Austria marry. It's a nice thought, really. Why bother with the messy, expensive business of armies and sieges when you can just send your daughter or your son over to the neighbor's castle and tie the knot? It certainly seems like a more civilized way to expand an empire, though perhaps a less considerate one for the people who actually had to get married. And marry they did. They married the rulers of Spain. They married the rulers of Hungary. They married into the houses that controlled the Low Countries and the territories of the Holy Roman Empire. They did a lot of marrying, but the trick to a successful long-term dynastic strategy is not just who you marry, but keeping the family's assets, the crowns and titles, all neatly together. You see, the whole point of a strategic marriage is to gain an inheritance, and if you marry someone outside the family, you risk diluting the brand, so to speak. You bring in new blood, new claims, new loyalties. This, apparently, was considered an unnecessary risk. So, the Habsburgs came to a decision that, in hindsight, was perhaps not their best one, though it certainly made administrative life easier for a while. They decided to keep the marrying very close to home. When we say close, we're not talking about marrying the third cousin from a neighboring, slightly less royal line. We are talking about marrying nieces, marrying first cousins, and sometimes even marrying a first cousin who was also a niece, just to keep things interesting. This was endogamy on a grand, almost industrial scale, and for a time it really worked. In terms of sheer geographical and political power, by the 16th century, the Habsburg Empire was so vast that people often said the sun literally never set on their dominions, which for a family that started as pretty much just a handful of castles in what is now Switzerland is quite the glow-up. But keeping things too close eventually leads to some rather distinct shall we say, quirks that start showing up in the family portrait gallery. The most famous of these quirks is, of course, the Habsburg jaw, or sometimes called the Habsburg lip or chin. It's medically known as mandibular prognathism, and it's basically an unusually large and protruding lower jaw, often combined with a thick lower lip. If you've ever seen a portrait of a late Spanish Habsburg, you know the look. It's distinctive. It's unmistakable. It was so common, in fact, that 17th century gossips would use the term Habsburg face as a simple visual shorthand for royalty that was having a difficult time keeping its collective chin back. It wasn't just a physical trait, it became a symbol of their dynasty's peculiar breeding habits. You can trace this jawline back, sliding through the family tree like a lazy river, all the way to Maximilian de 4059-1519, who was the Holy Roman Emperor and a genuinely important figure in the consolidation of Habsburg power. He was a savvy political operator, a patron of the arts, and the man who really formalized the whole marry, don't fight strategy. But he also passed on that signature chin. His son, Philip I of Castile, known as Philip the Handsome, a nickname that might have been a little generous, if the portraits are anything to go by, married Joanna of Castile. Joanna had her own set of dynastic claims, and the marriage was politically huge, adding the vast, newly unified Spanish kingdoms to the Habsburg portfolio. But both Maximilian and Philip, and later Joanna's son, Charles V, all displayed that prominent chin. Now, Charles the 1500-1558 was arguably the most powerful man in Europe at the time. He inherited the Habsburg lands in Austria, the Netherlands, and all of Spain's sprawling global territories. He had a truly incredible amount of power and an equally incredible jawline. His portraits are really something to behold, depicting a man burdened not just by the weight of a dozen crowns, but also by the weight of his own lower mandible. It was so pronounced that apparently he often had trouble chewing his food properly, which, when you are trying to rule a global empire, is just an inconvenient little annoyance on top of everything else. It really makes you wonder if anyone in his court dared to suggest maybe a slight adjustment to the dinner menu. It's from Charles V that the family line fractured into the two great branches, the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs, both branches having successfully secured their respective thrones through decades of careful and expensive marriage negotiations, continued the tradition of marrying within the family. It was almost like they had a deep institutional fear of introducing anyone new to the gene pool. The Spanish branch, particularly, seemed to take this internal marriage game to an absolute extreme, like it was a challenge they were trying to win. Over about 50 years, from Charles V down to the last Spanish Habsburg, there were 11 marriages between close relatives, first cousins, uncle-niece, or double first cousins. It was a dizzying level of relatedness. The most famous and perhaps most tragic result of this policy was the final Spanish Habsburg king, Charles II of Spain, 1661 to 1700. Poor Charles II. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely sad figure who ended up being the walking, talking pussification of a millennium of inbreeding. His contemporaries gave him the extremely unregal nickname El Hechizado, which means the bewitched. They thought his rather obvious, lifelong struggles were the result of black magic, which, when you look at his ancestry, is almost a more merciful explanation than the truth. Charles II's family tree was less a tree and more a very tightly wound shrub. If you map out his pedigree, you find something truly startling. While a person usually has 16 great-great-grandparents, Charles II effectively had only 10, because several of those 16 slots were filled by the same individuals multiple times. His parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria were uncle and niece. His maternal grandmother and paternal grandfather were siblings. His maternal grandfather and paternal grandmother were also siblings. He was, to put it mildly, genetically complex. From the moment he was born, it was clear Charles II was going to have a very difficult life. He was sickly, frail, and suffered from a truly debilitating array of physical and intellectual difficulties. He didn't learn to walk until he was 4 and didn't really speak until he was 8. And of course, the Habsburg jaw was present in him in its most severe final form. It was so extreme that he couldn't properly close his mouth, leading to persistent drooling and speech so difficult it was almost impossible to understand. The famous dynastic trait had, by the time it reached him, become a debilitating physical deformity. He was, however, the King of Spain and all its territories, which made his future a matter of massive European significance. The other great powers of Europe, France, England, and the Austrian Habsburgs, all watched Charles's slow, painful decline with the sort of keen, focused attention usually reserved for a really high-stakes poker game. The whole continent was waiting for him to die, because his death and the question of who would inherit his massive empire was going to kick off a continental war. They weren't being heartless, exactly. They were being political. The man was clearly never going to produce an heir. He was married twice, but both marriages were childless, which again was seen as proof by his contemporaries that he was simply bewitched. So, while poor Charles II struggled to chew his dinner and maintain a conversation, all the royal houses of Europe were already carving up his empire, trying to figure out which nephew or cousin who had managed to marry a daughter of the family just right would get the main prize. The end of the Spanish Habsburg line, a dynasty that had ruled one of the world's great empires for over a century and a half, didn't come with a bang or a great political catastrophe. It came with the whimper of a perpetually ill, genetically burdened man who simply failed to produce an heir. He died a month before his 39th birthday, leaving a will that naturally satisfied absolutely nobody and immediately plunging Europe into the long drawn-out conflict known as the War of the Spanish Succession. The ultimate price of keeping the crowns in the family turned out to be the end of the line and a massive, bloody war. The Austrians, though, they learned a little better. The Austrian Habsburgs survived the war, though they lost the Spanish throne. And while they continued a pattern of strategically close marriages, they didn't go quite as all-in on uncle-niece pairings as their Spanish cousins. They managed to float along for another century and a half, until the Great War finally dissolved their empire. But the Habsburg jaw, that famous marker of their internal marriage policy, remained a minor feature in the family even into the 20th century. It's a quiet little geological marker of a time when the greatest political calculation a royal family could make was about who their children should marry, a decision that eventually eroded their power and quite literally reshaped their faces. It's interesting how a political strategy can manifest so clearly as a physical trait that lasts for centuries, a visible signature of the price of power and the consequences of keeping the family circle just a bit too tight. The whole saga is a low-key, very slow-moving disaster, but one that took centuries to unfold, moving at the pace of a very long engagement and a very difficult childhood, and the War of the Spanish Succession, which followed that melancholy end of the Spanish Habsburgs, serves as a really nice pivot point, a moment where the focus of European royal oddities shifts a bit. We're going to slide gently eastward now, or at least across the border into France, to the realm of the Bourbons, a dynasty that had its own particular set of issues, though perhaps slightly less to do with the shape of their collective jaw and more to do with their truly enormous egos and extremely opulent taste in furniture. The central figure here is, of course, Louis XIV, 1638–1715, the famous Sun King. His reign was one of the longest in European history, an absolutely epic 72 years, and it was a reign defined by an almost aggressive sense of personal grandeur. Louis didn't just rule France, he was France in his own mind and in the minds of his courtiers. He perfected the art of absolute monarchy to a polished, intimidating sheen. And where did he do all this performing? Not in some dusty medieval palace, but at the ultimate piece of architectural performance art, the Palace of Versailles. Versailles is where the weirdness of elite life really blossoms, under Louis XIV. Before Versailles, royal courts were a bit more mobile, a bit more scattered. Louis fixed his court in place, dragging virtually the entire French nobility, thousands of people out of their power bases in the provinces, and locking them into a kind of gilded, exhausting residency program at the palace. This wasn't done out of a desire for lively company. It was a deeply savvy political move. By forcing the nobles to live at court, he could keep an eye on them, monitor their alliances, and most importantly, financially ruin them. You see, living at Versailles was expensive, terrifyingly expensive. You had to have the right clothes, the right carriages, the right retinue of servants. Everything was a competition in conspicuous consumption, a never-ending fashion show and popularity contest. The Sun King managed to transform a potentially rebellious, independently wealthy aristocracy into a collection of anxious, indebted supplicants, whose main goal in life was the entirely symbolic honor of being noticed by the king. He essentially neutralized the greatest threat to his power by turning them all into reality show contestants, desperate for a rose. The daily life at Versailles was a masterpiece of pointless, elaborate ritual. It was almost designed to be draining and confuse. Louis XIV's lever, the getting up ceremony, and his culture, the going to bed ceremony, were public spectacles, highly stratified events where dozens of nobles vied for the honor of doing things like holding the king's shirt or passing him his shoes. These were tasks that literally anyone could perform, but the social status conferred by, say, handing the king his stockings was so high that people fought wars of whispered words and subtle snubs over the privilege. It was an administration built on the principle of keeping everyone busy and utterly focused on the smallest possible details of royal life. The king, meanwhile, floated through it all, utterly calm, utterly central. Louis XIV was intensely focused on his image, which meant he was never allowed to appear human, messy, or even slightly off script. Everything was carefully choreographed. He was also, by the standards of the time, quite short, but he compensated for this by wearing enormous, elaborate wigs, the famous peruke, and very high-heeled shoes. These aren't the heels you see today. These were often crimson-soled heels that looked less like fashionable footwear and more like small, highly decorative platforms. This look, combined with his extremely elaborate diamond-encrusted clothing, helped him project the superhuman, towering image he felt was appropriate for the source of all light in France. But behind the wigs and the ritual, there was, as always, a deeply complicated personal life that had to be managed, or at least contained, within the rigid structure of the court. His official queen was Maria Theresa of Spain, a Habsburg princess, who was also his double first cousin, because apparently old habits die hard, even across the border. Maria Theresa was quiet, devout, and generally overlooked by the Sun King, who was much more interested in a long and rotating cast of official and unofficial mistresses. The management of these women, and the illegitimate children they produced, became another massive, ongoing project for the court. Louis didn't hide his mistresses. He often gave them apartments right next to the Queen, elevated them to Duchess status, and even had them officially received at court. The most famous of these long-term attachments was Françoise Athanase, Marquise de Montespan. She reigned as the maîtresse en titre, official mistress, for years, and their relationship produced 7 children, all of whom Louis legitimized. The arrangement was, of course, utterly humiliating for the Queen, but that was just the cost of doing business in a 17th century court. The interesting dynamic is how the mistress essentially became an unofficial cabinet position, a shadow queen who had real access to the king and therefore real political power. Courtiers would flock to Madame de Montespan's apartments, showering her with gifts and petitioning her to speak to the king on their behalf. Her power waxed and waned, and the atmosphere in the court could shift like the weather based on who the king was currently favoring. Towards the end of his life, however, Louis XIV seemed to tire of the scandalous high-drama world of the official mistress. His affections settled on a much quieter, more discreet woman named Françoise d'Aubigné, Marquise de Maintenon. Madame de Maintenon started as the governess for the Sun King's illegitimate children, with Madame de Montespan, a truly awkward employment history, if there ever was one. She was deeply religious, highly intelligent, and remarkably reserved. After Queen Maria Theresa died, Louis, now an older, more pious monarch, did something truly extraordinary. He secretly married Madame de Maintenon. This was a morganatic marriage, meaning she didn't become queen, and their children, had they had any, would have no succession rights. It was kept quiet, taking place in the dead of night with only a few trusted witnesses. For the next 30 years she lived at Versailles, not as the acknowledged queen, but as a kind of permanent, powerful, and utterly respectable companion. She ran her own quiet, pious court, exerted a massive, subtle influence on the aging king, and became a symbol of the second half of Louis XIV's long reign, the part where the glitter and the expense continued, but the underlying mood became a bit more subdued, a bit more serious. The irony of the Sun King, who had built the most public, most spectacular monarchy in European history, ending his life in a secret marriage with a former governess, is a beautiful little historical twist. It shows that even a monarch who thought of himself as a god needed a quiet, domestic arrangement away from the constant, exhausting spectacle. Louis XIV eventually died, having outlived his queen, his official mistresses, his son, and even his oldest grandson. The crown passed to his great-grandson, the 5-year-old Louis V. The long shadow of the Sun King's reign, the vast expense, the massive wars he had waged, and the sheer administrative burden of Versailles fell squarely on the shoulders of the succeeding generations. They inherited the greatest palace in Europe, a glittering but deeply indebted kingdom, and a court culture of ritual and superficiality that was almost impossible to escape, and all that glittering gold and highly strategic marriage plotting. It all felt like a very heavy inheritance, floating gently down to the final fatal act of the French monarchy a few generations later. So the crown slides onto the head of the great-grandson, Louis V, 1710, or no, 1774, a boy who was just 5 years old when the Sun King's famously long life finally sputtered out. This immediately creates a kind of political vacuum, a period of regency that is always a bit unstable, a bit messy. The regent was Louis V's uncle, Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, a man known for a truly legendary lack of personal restraint, and a court that was a stark contrast to the severe piety of Louis V's final years. Suddenly, Versailles, with its endless, suffocating ritual, was briefly abandoned for the more intimate, though much rowdier parties at the Palais Royal in Paris. But the young King Louis XV, the last surviving male member of the Bourbon line, remains a lonely, slightly shadowy figure throughout his childhood. He'd lost his parents and grandparents in a horrible quick succession of illnesses, leaving him isolated and cherished, yet also completely overwhelmed by the gravity of his inheritance. He grew up shy, reserved, and perhaps understandably, deeply mistrustful of the thousands of people who were constantly watching him, constantly trying to manipulate him. When he was finally old enough to rule in his own name, he initially displayed a genuine desire to govern and to care for his people, earning the early, slightly optimistic nickname, Louis the Well-Beloved. That nickname, as you might suspect, didn't stick around. Louis V's court life, once he took the reins, became an interesting study in contrasts. He moved back to the formal environment of Versailles, but he tried to escape its rigidity in a way the Sun King never would have dared. He created a series of small, private apartments, known as the Petits Appartements, tucked away in the sprawling palace. These were his retreats, rooms where he could actually relax, pursue private hobbies like locksmithing, and generally act like a normal, if extraordinarily wealthy person. This was an early sign of a deeper problem. The king was actively trying to hide from the very monarchy he was supposed to embody. He was bored by the ceremony, exhausted by the public role, and deeply uncomfortable with the sheer visibility that Louis XIV had created. This desire for privacy and avoidance created the perfect environment for the rise of the king's famous mistresses, who stepped into the vacuum left by the king's retreat from public life. Louis V then married a Polish princess, Marie Leszczyńska, who was devout and produced 10 children, but the marriage settled into a polite, distant arrangement. The real political and social focus shifted to the women who could capture the king's attention. The most powerful and famous of these was Jeanne Antoinette Portia, better known to history as Madame de Pompadour. She was not born into the high aristocracy. Her father was a successful financier who fled France after a scandal. She was, however, beautiful, intelligent, incredibly cultured, and utterly determined. She essentially groomed herself for the role of a royal mistress. In 1745, she was formally introduced to the king and almost immediately captured his complete devotion, a bond that lasted for 2 decades until her death. Louis V gave her the title of Marquise de Pompadour, and she quickly transformed her role from mere remote companion to one of the most powerful people in France. She wasn't just decorative, she was a shrewd politician, a relentless patron of the arts, and a decisive voice in both domestic and foreign policy. Her apartment at Versailles was effectively a second seat of government. Ministers knew that to get the king's ear, they often had to first convince Madame de Pompadour. She oversaw the decoration of the king's private retreats, commissioned magnificent works of art, and essentially became the tastemaker for an entire era, the Rococo period. All pastel colors, delicate curves, and elegant frivolity. The nobility at court absolutely hated her. They saw her as a social upstart, a mere commoner, even one ennobled by the king, who was wielding far too much power. They mocked her parentage, resented her influence, and constantly plotted her downfall. She was the target of an endless stream of truly venomous pamphlets and satirical poems, often referred to as poissonnades, a play on her maiden name, poisson, which means fish in French. But for 20 years, her position was unassailable because the king, for all his shyness and detachment, truly relied on her. She was not just his lover, she was his confidant, his companion, and his only reliable link to the political machinations he was so desperate to avoid. What's truly fascinating is that, After a period, her romantic relationship with the king ended, but her political and personal influence did not. She remained his official favorite and trusted advisor for years afterward, a truly unique status. The king gave her apartments directly above his own private ones, and she essentially became the chief of staff of the French monarchy, managing the royal correspondence and advising on everything from judicial appointments to military strategy. She was a workaholic in a court of professional idlers, and she eventually died in 1764 at the age of 42, physically exhausted by the immense strain of her role. She was the only mistress ever to die at Versailles, but the king, having found it impossible to rule without a powerful, charming woman by his side, found a replacement quickly, Jeanne Bécu, who became Madame du Barry. Du Barry was of a much humbler background than Pompadour, and her rise was even more scandalous to the high court. She was also less interested in the intellectual and political work that Pompadour had embraced. Du Barry was defined by her stunning beauty, her passion for fashion, and a much more relaxed, almost frivolous approach to court life. The court nobles, led by powerful families like the Noirs, went into a sustained, years-long snit. The most important woman at Versailles, the Dauphine Marie Antoinette, flatly refused to speak to Du Barry, creating one of the most famous sustained social conflicts in Versailles history. The Dauphine saw Du Barry as a vulgar interloper, and she avoided her completely, a calculated public snub that created a diplomatic crisis. The king was furious because the silence was seen as a deliberate disrespect to his chosen companion. The situation grew so tense that eventually the Austrian empress, Marie Antoinette's mother, had to intervene. The whole drama culminated in one of the most famously staged social victories in history. At a New Year's Day reception in 1772, Marie Antoinette, under intense pressure from her mother and the French foreign minister, finally uttered one single, perfect line to Du Barry. She simply said, "There are a lot of people at Versailles today." That was it. No praise, no apology, just a comment on the crowd. But that single neutral sentence was enough to be interpreted as a political surrender and a formal acknowledgement of Du Barry's position. It was a perfect microcosm of the court. Years of continental tension released by 8 simple, meaningless words. Louis XV, the lonely boy who grew into the detached king, died in 1774, contracting smallpox after an illness that quickly grew lethal. His final, terrible sickness was a frightening reminder of mortality in a court that was obsessed with eternal beauty and youth. The spectacle of the monarchy, which had been so carefully curated by Louis XIV, had by the time of Louis XV become a strange, tense drama of powerful women, a king trying to hide, and an aristocracy obsessed with the precise shade of a social slight. The whole system, all the gold and the ceremony, was starting to feel heavy, brittle, and deeply financially broken, floating gently toward a truly massive storm. So that brittle, financially broken system, left behind by Louis V, now falls to his grandson, Louis XVI, 1754 to 1793, who was 20 years old when he inherited the French throne. Louis XVI was, by all accounts, a well-intentioned, slightly awkward, and profoundly indecisive young man who had the truly spectacular misfortune of being king during one of the most volatile periods in European history. He was interested in geography, hunting, and metalworking, the kind of quiet, solitary hobbies that really don't prepare a person for navigating the treacherous politics of Versailles or the brewing discontent of a bankrupt nation. And if Louis XVI was awkward, his queen, Marie Antoinette, 1755 to 1793, was the very definition of a domestic mismatch. She was a Habsburg archduchess, the youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, and she arrived at the French court at the age of 14, bright, lively, and utterly unprepared for the suffocating, tradition-laden environment of Versailles. Her marriage to the future Louis XVI was intended to cement the new alliance between the ancient rivals, France and Austria, a political necessity that was deeply unpopular with the French nobility and people. They saw her as the Austrian, a foreign interloper, which was, of course, exactly what she was. The early years of their marriage were complicated, marked by a period of notorious non-consummation that lasted for 7 years. This wasn't a private matter, it was a matter of state, because the main purpose of a royal marriage was to produce an heir, and the entire court was watching. The couple was physically healthy, but the young king, perhaps due to shyness, ignorance, or a minor physical issue, was unable to fulfill his marital duties. The lack of children became the single greatest source of gossip, anxiety, and deeply cruel satire aimed at the royal couple. The whole business became an international embarrassment, requiring the Queen's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, to make a highly publicized and awkward visit to Versailles to essentially essay his brother-in-law some blunt medical-ish advice. Once the marriage was finally consummated, and children began to arrive, the immediate pressure eased, but Marie Antoinette's reputation was already damaged beyond repair. She retreated into a world of her own making, seeking comfort in an intense, exclusive circle of friends, and in an escalating cycle of extravagant fashion and gambling. The court, ever observing and ever cruel, seized upon her behavior. The Queen, who felt trapped by the formality of the court, spent lavishly on clothes, jewelry, and on her private retreat, the Petit Trianon, a small palace on the Versailles grounds. Here, she tried to play-act a simpler life, commissioning the creation of a rustic-looking model village, the Hameau de la Reine, complete with thatched roofs and a working farm. This was where the Queen and her ladies would sometimes dress up as milkmaids and shepherdesses, an utterly tone-deaf fantasy given the extreme poverty creeping across France. It wasn't that Marie Antoinette was inherently wicked. She was simply naive, spoiled, and culturally insensitive to the point of being politically disastrous. She became the perfect, glittering target for all the discontent that had been building up against the monarchy for decades. The financial extravagance of Louis XIV and Louis V, the mounting national debt, the endemic corruption of the aristocracy, all of it was suddenly personified in the figure of the young foreign queen. The final, fatal turning point in her reputation was the infamous affair of the diamond necklace. This was a truly unbelievable scam that unfolded in the 1780s, and it managed to implicate, or at least smear, almost every major institution of the French state. The short version is this: a truly massive, unbelievably expensive diamond necklace, originally commissioned for Louis V's last mistress, Madame du Barry, was sitting unsold because the state was already bankrupt. A deeply unscrupulous con artist, the Comtesse de la Motte, managed to convince a high-ranking but hopelessly gullible Cardinal, Louis de Rohan, that the Queen, Marie Antoinette, secretly wanted the necklace, but couldn't buy it openly due to public opinion. De Rohan, desperate to get into the Queen's favor after years of being excluded, believed the Comtesse's lies. The scam was elaborate and included the Comtesse hiring a prostitute to impersonate the Queen in a nighttime meeting with the Cardinal in the Versailles Gardens. The Cardinal eventually signed papers guaranteeing payment for the necklace, believing he was acting as the Queen's secret agent. The jewelers handed over the necklace, which was immediately broken up and sold for parts in London by the Countess's accomplices. When the massive bills came due, the cardinal was arrested in the middle of Mass at Versailles, an unprecedented act. The trial that followed was a public spectacle, though the Parliament of Paris eventually acquitted the cardinal, who they believed had been duped, and found Marie Antoinette completely innocent of any involvement. The damage was irreversible. The public opinion was already fixed. The people believed that the Queen had ordered the necklace, that she had conspired to have the cardinal take the fall, or at the very least, that her boundless vanity and spending habits were the direct cause of the whole humiliating mess. The affair wasn't just a scandal. It was a complete, final destruction of the monarchy's moral authority. The idea that the Queen was secretly meeting with a cardinal in the dark gardens, or that she was spending a fortune on jewelry while the populace starved, confirmed every pamphlet and rumor that had been circulating for decades. The monarchy had become a farce, and the king, who had allowed this situation to fester, was seen as weak and ineffective. So, when the true financial crisis struck, exacerbated by France's costly involvement in the American Revolution and years of poor harvests, the king was forced to call the Estates General in 1789, the first time in 1750 years. This was intended to be a financial quick fix, a way to raise new taxes. Instead, it became the spark for the French Revolution. All the pent-up resentment, the Habsburg chin, the Sun King's endless rituals, the mistress's power, the Queen's debts, all of it came boiling over. The quiet, awkward king and his naive, much maligned queen were about to face the most catastrophic consequence of centuries of insulated, extravagant elite living, as the gentle, sleepy irony of their ancestors' lives gives way to a truly frightening and energetic chaos. The chaos we talked about, the one that swallowed the French monarchy, started out almost politely. The revolutionaries didn't immediately set out to abolish the king. They mostly wanted to reform him, to turn him into a constitutional monarch, a kind of highly decorative national figurehead. But Louis XVI, the awkward, indecisive man who really just wanted to tinker with locks and go hunting, simply wasn't capable of playing that role. He wasn't a tyrant, but he was certainly a prisoner of his own inherited tradition, the deeply ingrained belief that he was chosen by God to rule. The whole situation came to a head in the summer of 1791, with the famous flight to Versailles. The royal family, having been forcibly moved from Versailles to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, which was essentially a very grand, very public house arrest, decided they had had enough. They made a truly disastrous decision to try and escape the capital and reach the safety of a loyalist military base near the border. It was a massive, last-ditch gamble, and it was engineered with all the quiet desperation of people who knew their world was crumbling. The escape itself was a comedy of errors that would be funny if it weren't so tragic. The plans were ridiculously elaborate and involved a truly unnecessary level of theatricality. Instead of leaving quietly in a small, fast carriage, they insisted on traveling in a massive, heavy, custom-built carriage, a 6-horse berline, which moved slowly and looked exactly like the extravagant conveyance of a very important person. The king, who was already recognizable from his famous profile on French coinage, was disguised as a valet, a role he was physically and emotionally unsuited for, as he was a large man accustomed to being waited on. They managed to get quite far, gliding through the night towards the eastern border, a journey punctuated by delays caused by the sheer size of their carriage and the king's insistence on taking very long, very public breaks. The real disaster struck when they were recognized in a small town called Saint-Ménehould. The local postmaster, Jean-Baptiste Duret, noticed the king's face on a sonnet, a form of revolutionary paper currency, and realized who the valet in the massive carriage must be. Drode didn't hesitate. He mounted his horse and, in a truly cinematic turn of events, rode ahead to the next significant stop, the town of Voron. He roused the local authorities just minutes before the royal carriage arrived. The family was stopped, not by a great army or a master revolutionary, but by a handful of local guards and a crowd of bewildered but quickly infuriated citizens. This event, the capture and the subsequent humiliating forced return to Paris, changed everything. Before Varian, the idea of a constitutional monarchy was still feasible. After Varian, the king was no longer seen as merely ineffective or ill-advised. He was seen as a traitor, someone who had abandoned his people and tried to join their enemies. The entire concept of the king's divinity, his sacred God-given right to rule, evaporated in the dust of the road back to Paris. He was no longer a king. He was a man named Louis Capet, who had tried to flee his responsibility. The journey back was pure agony. The royal carriage was surrounded by an angry, silent mob. The trip that had taken 2 days to flee took 4 days to return. Moving at a snail's pace through towns where crowds openly insulted the king and queen. When they finally reached Paris, they were met by a silent, tense crowd estimated to be over 100,000 people. The National Assembly, the governing body of the revolution, had given a chilling order. Whoever applauds the king shall be beaten. Whoever insults him shall be hanged. The silence was deafening and far more frightening than any shouts. The consequences of this failure played out slowly, with the agonizing slowness that characterizes historical inevitability. Louis XVI was formally suspended from his duties. France declared itself a republic in 1792, and the monarchy that had reigned for centuries was simply abolished. The final act of the tragedy was the king's trial. It wasn't a trial in the modern sense. It was a political spectacle, a symbolic act necessary to sever France entirely from its past. The charges were essentially treason against the nation, and the trial focused on all of his perceived betrayals, particularly his flight to Varennes and his secret correspondence with foreign powers. Louis XVI conducted himself with a quiet, stolid dignity that surprised many of his accusers, but his fate was sealed long before the verdict. In January of 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. This was a truly unprecedented moment in European history, the public, legal execution of a reigning monarch that sent shivers through every royal house across the continent. This was not a palace coup. This was the final, irreversible statement that the traditional authority of kings was dead. The man who had been the most powerful monarch in Europe just a few years earlier died with quiet resignation. 9 months later, the Queen, Marie Antoinette, followed him to the guillotine. Her trial was less dignified, more explicitly political, and viciously gendered. She was accused of everything from treason to the most appalling, unfounded charges of immorality. She faced her fate with a composure and strength she had rarely shown in life, a tragic figure who had finally found her resolve at the very end. The woman who had been the symbol of royal extravagance and foreign influence was now simply a widow, a mother, and a final sacrifice. The revolution, of course, did not stop there. It consumed many of its own children in the ensuing reign of terror, but the quiet, hesitant king and his extravagant queen, the ones whose simple inability to produce a quick heir or make a smooth escape had so defined their lives, remain the central tragic figures of that transition. Their story is the ultimate, non-sleepy example of what happens when centuries of dynastic insularity and financial irresponsibility finally collide with the harsh, wide-awake realities of a truly desperate populace. The velvet of Versailles was simply too thin to stop the blades that followed. So we drift now, gently pulling away from the messy business of the French Revolution, allowing the echo of the guillotine to fade. We're going to slide eastward again, back toward the old Habsburg heartland, but also looking across to a peculiar, small corner of the British monarchy, because the 19th century brings its own distinct flavor of royal distress and odd habits, often far removed from the high-stakes politics of crowns and queens. Let's first settle for a moment on the Austrian Habsburgs, the line that managed to survive the War of the Spanish Succession and the French Revolutionary Wars. Though their empire was perpetually shrinking and their power constantly challenged, their reigning figure for most of the 19th century was Emperor Franz Joseph I, 1830–1916. Franz Joseph had one of those truly long, slow reigns, 68 years, that ended up bridging an entire epoch from the fading era of absolute monarchy right up to the catastrophic start of World War I. He was the very model of an intensely bureaucratic, deeply conservative, and utterly emotionally reserved monarch. He woke up early, worked tirelessly, and signed an almost unbelievable amount of paperwork every single day. He was, to put it mildly, boringly dedicated to duty, but the lives around him were anything but boring. His personal life was a string of truly remarkable disasters. His brother, Maximilian, was installed as the Emperor of Mexico in a French-backed scheme, only to be executed by a Mexican firing squad in 1867, a truly humiliating and tragic end that sent shockwaves through the family. Then there was his only son, Crown Prince Rudolph, who was a restless, liberal and deeply troubled young man trapped in the suffocating routine of the Viennese court. Rudolph and his mistress, Baroness Mary Vatsera, were found dead in 1889 at the Meerling hunting lodge in an event that was officially labeled a suicide pact, but remains clouded by secrecy, rumor, and intense political cover-up. The Crown Prince, the direct heir to the vast Habsburg Empire, had simply checked out in the most dramatic way possible. And then there was his wife, the famous Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Sisi, 1837–1898. Sisi was a truly beautiful, incredibly eccentric figure who found the rigid, soul-crushing formality of the Viennese court absolutely intolerable. She was perhaps the original celebrity who just wanted to be left alone, while her husband was signing stacks of decrees in his office. Sisi was off traveling the globe, pursuing a truly obsessive dedication to her own beauty and physical fitness. She maintained a famous, almost pathological, 20-inch waistline her entire adult life, and had a truly magnificent head of hair that, when let down, reached the floor. She spent literally hours every day maintaining this hair, an almost ritualistic dedication to physical perfection. Sisi was perpetually restless, escaping Vienna whenever possible. She wrote poetry, studied Greek, and was fascinated by tragic figures and the concept of death. She was deeply unhappy in her marriage and role, and her life was a series of extended emotional and geographical absences from the court. She eventually met a sudden, tragic end that fit her dramatic life. She was assassinated by an Italian anarchist while walking on the promenade near Lake Geneva in 1898. The assassin, Luigi Lucchini, was not targeting Sisi specifically. He simply wanted to kill a royal, any royal, as a protest against the European aristocracy. He stabbed her with a small, sharpened file, an unbelievably tiny, mundane weapon that just happened to strike her heart. She was so tightly corseted that she didn't realize she was mortally wounded until she collapsed a few moments later. Franz Joseph, the king who was never really emotionally present for his family, was left alone to rule an increasingly fragile empire, surrounded by the ghosts of his son and his assassinated wife. both victims in their own way of the system he so relentlessly upheld. He just kept signing the papers, right up until the point when his empire was engulfed by the Great War. Now let's take a sharp little slide across the channel to England, to the rather curious case of King George III, 1738-1820. He was the King of Great Britain during the American Revolution, and he is often remembered in American history books as the tyrant who lost the colonies. But his later life was dominated by something far more personal and tragic. Episodes of what was called madness by his contemporaries. These bouts of severe mental and physical illness started in the 1780s. The king would suffer from periods of intense agitation, confusion, rambling, and sometimes terrifying outbursts of inappropriate behavior. He would talk endlessly and nonsensically, sometimes for hours, often repeating phrases, and was subject to violent physical restraints by his doctors when they tried to treat him. These episodes were always treated with the utmost secrecy and political urgency because, just like the French, if the king couldn't rule, who could? This was the era that gave rise to the famous Mad King narratives, a truly unsettling time for the British Roger. The physical symptoms means his mental state, including stomach pain, blood in his urine, and a dark blue-purple discoloration of his urine and stool, are now widely believed by many historians and medical professionals to have been caused by porphyria. Porphyria is a rare inherited blood disorder that can cause excruciating physical symptoms, often leading to severe neurological and psychiatric problems that mimic madness. Regardless of the precise diagnosis, the impact of these recurring episodes on the monarchy was immense. It led to political crises as factions fought over the control of the regency, who would rule when the king was incapacitated. His son, the famously profligate and self-indulgent Prince of Wales, later King George IV, was keen to take over, which only deepened the political instability. George III's final, slow decline began around 1810. He lost his sight almost completely, and the bouts of confusion and distress became permanent. For the last 10 years of his life, he was simply confined to Windsor Castle, blind, confused, and increasingly isolated, completely unaware that a new century had dawned, or that the Napoleonic Wars had been fought and won. His presence was a silent, embarrassing political complication, forcing his son to rule as Prince Regent. The tragedy of George III is that he was generally a decent, kind, and dutiful man, who was struck down by an agonizing, misunderstood illness that stripped him of his power and dignity in the most humiliatingly public way. His reign, bookended by the loss of America and a decade of silence and darkness in a locked room, serves as a poignant reminder that even the most powerful kings could be reduced to the fragility of a quiet, suffering human being floating in a confused silence while the world raged outside his castle windows. Sliding now across the whole expanse of Europe, we come to the final great imperial house, whose dynastic struggles were doomed to end in truly spectacular tragedy. The Romanovs of Russia. They ruled an unimaginably vast, intensely complicated territory, and the final chapter of their reign centers on the truly complicated, high-strung, and eventually fatal relationship between the last Tsar, Nicholas II, 1868-1918, and his Empress, Alexandra Fyodorovna, 1870. Alexandra was originally Princess Alex of Hesse, and by Rhine, a German princess and a favorite granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Great Britain. She was highly intelligent, intensely shy, and prone to a certain rigidity of character. When she married Nicholas II, who was equally shy, deeply religious, and profoundly unprepared for the responsibilities of the throne, the stage was set for a difficult reign. Nicholas II had a rather simple view of his own power. He believed completely in the autocracy, the idea that his power was absolute and granted directly by God, making any political reform a kind of sacrilege. This was a man trying to govern a vast, restive, modernizing country with the mindset of a 17th century Tsar. Alexandra, for her part, brought her own intensity to the role of empress. She was deeply committed to her husband's view of autocracy, often viewing any political compromise as a sign of weakness or betrayal. She was also intensely insecure about her position among the Russian people, who often viewed her as aloof, cold, and critically German. This foreign background became a serious liability as tensions with Germany rose, sliding the empress into deeper isolation and emotional reliance on a very small, very close circle of confidantes. The central, constant, and utterly terrifying anxiety of their private lives was the health of their only son, the heir apparent, Alexei. After having 4 daughters, the birth of a Tsarevich was a moment of national celebration, but that joy was immediately shadowed by the terrible, secret knowledge that Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a devastating inherited blood disorder that was passed down through Alexandra's side of the family, a genetic legacy from Queen Victoria. Any minor bump or bruise could turn into a life-threatening internal bleed, making the life of the royal heir a perpetual, low-grade medical emergency. The diagnosis of hemophilia was kept a complete, state-level secret. The Russian people and most of the court had no idea that their future Tsar was perpetually frail. The burden of this secret, the constant fear of a catastrophic bleed, and the deep, understandable devotion of the parents to their suffering son, created a kind of psychological hothouse around the Romanov family. It made the empress particularly vulnerable to anyone who could offer hope, a weakness that led directly to the most bizarre and damaging aspect of their later reign, the rise of Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a Siberian peasant, a charismatic, unwashed, and deeply controversial starets, a type of spiritual wanderer or holy man. He was introduced to the royal family because he seemed to possess a truly uncanny ability to comfort the Tsarevich and, more crucially, to stop his bleeding episodes. It's difficult to say exactly how he did it. It might have been hypnosis, a calming presence that lowered the boy's pulse and blood pressure, or perhaps simply removing the conventional court doctors who often relied on aspirin, which is now known to exacerbate bleeding. Whatever the mechanism, the results were visible, and for Nicholas and Alexandra, desperate to save their son, Rasputin quickly became a miracle worker, a sign of divine intervention. The devotion to Rasputin soon bordered on the absolute, particularly from the empress. He was given incredible access to the family, to the palace, and soon to matters of state. He was a constant, unsettling presence, a peasant with truly terrible social habits and a growing reputation for drunken debauchery, lurking at the very center of one of the most formal courts in the world. The aristocracy was horrified, the church was suspicious, and the public was openly scandalized. Every military defeat, every bureaucratic failure was increasingly laid at the feet of the mad monk and the empress, who was widely perceived to be under his spell. This reliance on Rasputin completely destroyed the moral authority of the Romanovs in the eyes of the public and the nobility. When World War I broke out, Nicholas II made the disastrous decision to leave the capital and take direct command of the Russian armies at the front. This left Alexandra in charge of the government in St. Petersburg, relying almost entirely on Rasputin's opaque, self-serving advice to appoint and dismiss ministers. This created a political instability that was almost breathtaking in its speed. It was a court run on the whims of an anxious mother, and a scruffy, drunken mystic. Eventually, a group of powerful, conservative nobles, horrified by the destruction of the monarchy's reputation, and believing that Rasputin was the source of all Russia's woes, decided to take matters into their own hands. The story of his assassination in December 1916 is one of the most famously melodramatic events in all of history. A chaotic scene involving poisoned cakes, multiple gunshots, a drowning attempt in the icy Neva River, and a final, humiliating burial under a blanket of secrecy. But by then, it was far too late. The removal of Rasputin didn't save the monarchy, it only destabilized the situation further. The public fury, the military failures of the war, and the catastrophic mismanagement of the economy all coalesced. The long, slow drift of the Romanov dynasty, with its inherited hemophilia and its desperate reliance on a dark-side mystic, was about to collide with the sharp, cold edge of the February Revolution in 1917. The Tsar, convinced that his duty was paramount, and the Empress, convinced that her foreign background made her an ideal target, were about to discover that 1,000 years of divine right can evaporate in a single desperate moment. Their story is a chilling reminder that the most significant problems of states often arise from the most quiet, closely held secrets of the heart. The inevitable collision arrived in February 1917, triggered by massive labor strikes and food riots in St. Petersburg, which had been patriotically renamed Petrograd. The Russian military, weary and humiliated by the war, refused to fire on the crowds. Suddenly, the entire weight of the Romanov autocracy, which had seemed so permanent, collapsed under the pressure of popular dissent. Tsar Nicholas II, isolated at his military headquarters and relying on outdated information, was eventually convinced by his generals that the only way to save the country from civil war was to abdicate. He signed the papers on March 15, 1917, not for himself, but also for his hemophiliac son, Alexei, passing the throne instead to his brother, Grand Duke Michael, who wisely declined the poisoned crown. And just like that, the 300-year-old dynasty of the Romanovs was over, not with a massive, organized revolution like in France, but with a quiet, almost bewildered administrative signing of papers on a train. The royal family, having been stripped of all their power and title, was placed under house arrest. Initially in the beautiful Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, they spent their first months of captivity in a kind of gentle, bewildered limbo, maintaining a semblance of their daily routine, tending a small garden, and simply waiting for the provisional government to figure out what to do with them. The initial plan, pushed by the provisional government, was to exile the family to Great Britain, a natural place, since Empress Alexandra was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and Tsar Nicholas II was a first cousin to King George V. But the British government, wary of the rising tide of anti-royal sentiment at home, and concerned about the political optics of welcoming a dethroned autocrat, quietly and rather coldly withdrew the offer. The Romanovs were now orphans in the revolutionary storm, with nowhere to go. As the political situation in Russia grew more radical, especially after the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, the Romanovs' fate grew significantly darker. They were moved deeper and deeper into the Russian interior, away from the turmoil of the capitals. A gentle drift that was, in fact, a tightening of the noose. First, they were moved to Bolsk in Siberia, where they lived in the mansion of a former governor, and then, as the civil war intensified and the Bolshevik fear of a royalist rescue plot grew, they were moved to their final destination, Ekaterinburg, in the Ural Mountains. In Ekaterinburg, they were housed in a requisitioned, 2-story stone mansion known as the Apatiev House. This was a small, unprepossessing residence, surrounded by a high wooden fence and constantly guarded. The irony of the name was lost on no one. Apativ was the name of the monastery in Kostroma, where the Romanov dynasty had begun its long, slow ascent 3 centuries earlier. The final act would play out in a house bearing the name of their origin. Life in the Ipatiev house was a monotonous, humiliating ordeal. The guards, many of them local factory workers and former soldiers, were often crude and disrespectful. The family was confined to a few rooms on the 2nd floor, forced to adhere to strict schedules, and suffered constant intrusions into their privacy. The Tsar, who had once commanded millions, was now forced to listen to revolutionary songs sung loudly beneath his window. The quiet dignity with which they endured this, a stark contrast to their earlier self-absorption, is one of the more heartbreaking aspects of the story. The end came suddenly in July 1918. The Bolsheviks' grip on the area was becoming tenuous. The White Army, the anti-Bolshevik forces, were rapidly approaching Ekaterinburg. The local Soviet leadership, likely operating under orders or at least tacit approval from the central Bolshevik leadership, decided they could not risk the Tsar falling into the hands of the enemy, where he could become a rallying symbol for the counter-revolution. In the dead of night, in the early hours of July 17th, 1918, the entire family was roused from their sleep and told to dress. They were led down to a small, semi-basement room in the Apatiev house, told they were being moved because of a supposed threat from the approaching white forces. Nicholas II, the Empress Alexandra, their 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and the young Tsarevich, Alexei, were assembled in the room, along with their 4 remaining loyal retainers, the family doctor, a cook, a valet, and a maid. The room was small, cold, and dimly lit. A group of Bolshevik executioners filed in, led by the commandant of the house. The commandant read a brief, formal statement. The Urals Regional Soviet of Workers' Deputies has decided to execute you. Nicholas II barely had time to ask, "What?" before the firing squad began their terrible work. The violence was chaotic and brutally messy. The initial volley did not kill everyone, partly because the daughters had sewn jewels into their corsets, which acted like a macabre temporary body armor, deflecting the bullets. It took a horrifying, agonizing amount of time, involving repeated shots and bayonets, to finally silence the room. The bodies were then hastily wrapped, loaded onto a truck, and taken out into the forest. Their subsequent disposal, including attempts to dismember the bodies, burn them with acid, and bury them in an unmarked, waterlogged mine shaft, was as clumsy and desperate as their capture. The entire action was carried out under a veil of complete secrecy, creating a mystery that persisted for decades, and gave rise to the enduring myth of Anastasia, the possibility that one of the daughters had miraculously survived. The final end of the Romanovs, a death chamber beneath a middle-class house in a remote city, was the ultimate, shattering proof that the old order of divine right and dynastic inheritance was truly gone. It was a chaotic, unceremonious, and deeply tragic conclusion to centuries of absolute rule. The era of royal oddities and inherited power struggles had finally run out of patience, dissolving into the quiet, frozen ground of the Urals. The history of those intertwined strange and tragic lives, from the Habsburg jaw to the Sun King's wig to the Tsarevich bleed, finally comes to a complete, final, and silent stop.